By the time I reached the final years of my career, I'd seen it all. I'd spent 12 years as a beat cop before I got the chance to work with a detective and a crime scene investigator on a double homicide. Thanks to my connections from all those years on the streets, we gathered enough information to catch the people responsible. After that, I moved out of patrol and spent a solid decade investigating cases of sexual assault, arson, and armed robbery. I kept learning by taking specialized training courses, diving deep into old cases, and studying the habits of offenders. I worked with the drug enforcement team on major assault cases and the occasional murder. Eventually, I took over for a retiring detective. I already knew his partner, Harrison, and we hit it off right away. I'm mentioning all this to give you an idea of what I've been through. In over 30 years on the job, I've seen things no one should have to see. Things that stay with you, haunting your thoughts and dreams. I've locked up a lot of criminals, and I can tell you, most of them weren't pure evil. They had reasons, sometimes pathetic ones, behind their actions. Then there are the ones who take things further. The ones who take violent crimes to a level that makes you question what's inside them. And then there are the ones who are just pure evil, who dream up nightmares for no reason at all. Just because they can. Emily Davis was one of those people. She wasn't just your typical serial killer. She was the first person I met who I could say had true evil inside her. Emily was a registered nurse who worked at an OB/GYN clinic in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods. This place had a terrible track record when it came to miscarriages and stillbirths, but the numbers were covered up. Eventually, word started to spread, and people began to talk about how many deaths had occurred. Our station got the call, and normally, a case like this would be passed on to someone else. But we were short on manpower, so Harrison and I were assigned to it. As we dug deeper, we discovered that Emily had been at the clinic for 23 years, and during that time, there had been over 2,000 miscarriages. She was giving the expectant mothers a drug she claimed would help them sleep. Instead, it was slowly killing the babies inside them. We also found out that after a number of healthy births, Emily would take the baby away for cleaning, but then come back to report that the baby had died shortly after birth. Our investigation didn't give us solid proof of what was going on, but we started to believe that Emily had been lying to the mothers, telling them their babies were dead when, in fact, they were alive. She was selling them off to the highest bidder. Healthy babies fetch a pretty penny on the black market, whether for organ harvesting, stem cell research, or worse. We thought there might be a racial motive because nearly all the mothers involved were black, but Emily denied everything. I remember the first time we interviewed Emily. She looked calm and collected, her face showing emotion as she answered our questions. But her eyes, those eyes, were dead. Empty. The longer you looked at them, the more you felt like something wasn't right. Even after the trial, where she was sentenced to multiple life terms, Emily still swore she was innocent. The next time I ran into something truly sinister, it spiraled into a case involving multiple incidents. Harrison and I were called in to look into an attack at a beach volleyball tournament. This event was huge, taking place on the city's largest beach. It spanned the whole weekend, with over 300 teams competing on 50 courts. The players were a mix of ages, from 12-year-olds to people well into their 60s, men and women alike. Everything started off like any other tournament, but then it quickly took a dark turn. It was still early in the morning, right before the first game kicked off, when the first scream rang out. It wasn't just one scream, though. It quickly turned into a wave of them. Within moments, there were hundreds of people screaming in panic. Over a third of the players had to be rushed for medical help. The damage was unbelievable, deep cuts across their feet, legs, and even faces. Some of them had injuries so bad they wouldn't be able to walk, let alone play sports again. It turns out someone had come to the beach the night before the tournament and set up a trap. They'd buried dozens of pieces of wood in the sand, each one with sharp razor blades sticking up in the center, like upside-down T's. They were hidden just beneath the surface, making them impossible to see. Whoever did this had to have spent hours preparing the beach for this nightmare. Miraculously, no one died, but the injuries were severe. Young athletes had their careers destroyed in a matter of seconds. Like we always do, we started at the crime scene and worked our way out. The crime scene investigators were combing through every inch of the beach, but Harrison and I focused on talking to the tournament organizers, trying to find anyone who might have a reason to hurt them or sabotage the event. But our leads came up empty. Sadly, the investigation didn't get any better. The beach was covered in so many footprints, shoes, sandals, all kinds of tracks, that it was impossible to follow anything. Even worse, whoever set up the trap had carefully cleaned the razor blades and the wood with bleach before burying them in the sand, making it nearly impossible to gather any trace evidence. The beach had no cameras, and the one camera at the parking lot didn't capture anything between midnight and 7 a.m. when the attack happened. Our phones were ringing constantly with tips, but none of them panned out. After a month of dead ends, we were stuck. Then another case landed on our desks. Our department was already stretched thin, but Harrison and I were called in to handle this one too. A fire had broken out in the basement of a senior care facility along the waterfront. The flames spread quickly due to accelerants, consuming the first 2 floors in minutes. From there, it tore through the rest of the 8-story building. In total, 22 residents and 9 staff members died, all from smoke inhalation. We pored over the security footage, but once again, no suspects showed up. There were no cameras near the parking lots or entrances, and the rear cameras had been destroyed in the fire, so we couldn't check there either. And then, just when we thought things couldn't get worse, another case came in. This time, it was a mass poisoning at a junior high school cafeteria. 23 people died, 15 of them students, and more than 100 others were critically injured. Our investigation revealed that someone had broken into the school overnight and laced every single food item in the cafeteria with arsenic. It was nothing short of a miracle that more people didn't die. Thankfully, the school's exterior cameras were operational, and after going through all the footage, we finally found something useful. One of the backdoor cameras caught a person in all black, wearing a hood and a ski mask. They used lockpicking tools to get inside the building. After poisoning the food, they left through the same door and ran off across the soccer field toward the water. That's when everything started to make sense. The beach volleyball courts, the seniors' home, and now the junior high, they all bordered the water. The school had taken full advantage of its waterfront location, offering students the opportunity to try rowing, kayaking, sailing, swimming, and other water-related activities. The seniors' home had been partially marketed for its incredible view of the water, promising residents a peaceful and scenic environment. After connecting these 3 crimes, we began to believe they were all linked to the same person. It wasn't just a coincidence. The waterfront was a key factor in each of them. We marked all 3 locations on a map and started scanning the coastline, looking for any marinas, docks, or harbors nearby. Then, we revisited the routes and identified several hotspots we knew had surveillance cameras, hoping to capture something useful. Using the dates of the incidents, we cross-referenced the footage, hoping to spot any recurring boats in the area during the nights the crimes occurred. It was a lot of footage to sift through. Eventually, one boat stood out. It was a large, older black speedboat driven by a lone figure, but we couldn't get a clear look at the driver. There was a red light glowing from inside the cabin, but nothing else that gave us a good lead. Harrison and I took photos of the boat and went back to the marinas and harbors. We checked several docks, but none had any records of the boat or sightings of it, which led us to suspect it might be docking at a private residence instead. I reached out to a buddy of mine from narcotics, Rick, and he brought up a concern I hadn't thought of: drug boats. Apparently, a lot of drug users in the city had moved away from alleyways and rundown buildings and started using small boats as floating pill houses. These boats could be docked in secluded coves and harbors, difficult for law enforcement to reach and easier to keep out of sight for long periods. They could stay there for months without attracting attention. The 6-month rule for boats was mostly ignored, and so the cove near the last dock we visited had become a hotspot for these floating drug havens. Rick agreed to help. One night, he snuck onto one of the docks where about 30 boats were loosely tied together. After making his way through the cluster, he found our black boat. He learned the boat was owned by a guy people called Zane, a dealer who let people shoot up and pass out on his boat. The next night, Rick went back. This time, Harrison and I kept our distance, with the Coast Guard backing us up. We had Rick wired so we could listen in on everything that happened on board. His plan was to get on the boat with a few other users, pretend to buy and use heroin, and then fake a drug overdose. He would fall asleep in front of everyone, giving us the chance to catch whoever was behind this. Harrison and I sat quietly, listening to the casual chatter from the other users as they bought their supplies and prepped for whatever came next. Soon enough, the voices began to fade. Even Rick's voice disappeared. Then, a rough, agitated voice broke the silence, asking if anyone was still awake. There was no answer. The voice, Zane's, laughed low and cold. "Good," he muttered. We heard a shuffle, followed by the engine of the boat roaring to life. It cut through the quiet of the cove, peeling out into the open water. Rick had a GPS tracker hidden in his shoe, so Harrison and I kept an eye on the monitor, tracking the boat as it moved out toward the sea. We followed from a distance, with the Coast Guard's lights turned off, completely hidden in the dark. Minutes ticked by. We stayed quiet, listening intently. Then, the boat's engine began to die down. All we could hear were chains clinking, dragging over the metal deck. Rick's voice crackled through the mic, frantic, almost panicked. "He's chaining us together. There's an anvil on one end." The captain snapped the lights on and flipped the sirens. The boat gunned it toward the blinking blip on our radar. From the mic, we heard Zane's voice again. He'd noticed the sirens. He was starting to panic, and according to Rick, was ready to toss the anvil overboard. But Rick wasn't having it. He'd managed to surprise Zane, getting the drop on him and locking him in a chokehold. By the time we arrived, Zane was out cold, lying on the floor of the boat. Rick sat on his back, keeping him down. The floor was littered with bodies. 5 of them. All users, all dead. Zane had poisoned them with spike batches, and they had died just minutes before we got there. Back on land, interrogating Zane was a terrifying experience. It was useless because he didn't say a word. Terrifying because he didn't have to say anything. His silence was enough. He'd bitten off his own tongue just before we brought him in. Zane spent the next day and a half in a hospital, recovering before we could sit him down with a pencil and paper to try and get something out of him. But we didn't need him to talk. The evidence was overwhelming. There was enough to lock him up for the 5 deaths on that boat alone. Then, divers found more bodies, more victims, along the same stretch of water where Zane had been boating. All in all, it seemed Zane was responsible for the deaths of over 50 people. And that didn't even account for the beach volleyball tournament, the seniors' home, or the junior high school. The thing that stuck with me the most about sitting across from Zane in those interviews were his eyes. Just like Emily's. His face twitched, his expressions changed, but his eyes, those empty black eyes, never wavered, always locking onto mine. We never learned the true reason behind his actions, the motive that drove him. All we could find was his history. Zane had bounced between foster homes until his 16th birthday. Strangely enough, there was a house fire that killed his foster parents and 2 other children. After that, Zane seemed to vanish for a while. A few years later, he was arrested for assault in a movie theater and spent most of his 20s in and out of prison. Who knows how much destruction Zane had caused in those years? How much darkness he'd left in his wake? The 3rd time I encountered true evil came as Harrison was nearing retirement. It was our last case together. Poetically, in a sense, we had been investigating the disappearance of 6 young women, all Caucasian, between the ages of 18 and 22. It didn't seem to fit the usual pattern of trafficking, and we ruled out grooming gangs. We'd done a lot of legwork, following up with interviews from family and friends. No one changed their stories. Everyone seemed solid. We didn't have a single lead, but we did find one link. All the women had connections to underground heavy metal and punk rock scenes, and all of them seemed to share an odd fascination with Satanism. Going over the details of each disappearance, Harrison and I discovered a strange coincidence. All the disappearances coincided with the performances of a certain opening band at a weekly death metal show. They were called Helvete, a Norwegian black metal band that had a reputation for covering themselves in what looked like blood and performing in eerie masks. Each mask was different, but followed a similar design: a face with eyes, nose, and mouth. But the texture looked like dried skin, with dark wicker twigs sticking out from the back, resembling a porcupine's spines. The more we dug into the band, the more they became our prime suspects. We got an address and decided it was time to pay them a visit. The farmhouse was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a vast plot of land and forest. The walk up to the house had me on edge. It was dusk, and the sky shifted from orange to deep blue. The farmhouse was massive, old, and weathered. From inside, death metal thumped so loud that it rattled the windows. A large black van sat in the back, with two sedans parked up front. Then, a scream broke through the music, louder than any of the death metal riffs. I drew my 9mm, and Harrison followed suit, pulling his .38. We called for backup and made our way inside through the unlocked front door. Inside, the house had a staircase to the right, leading up to the second floor, and a hallway to the left that opened up to the living room, dining room, and kitchen. More screams followed, now joined by chanting. We knew the screams were coming from downstairs, and we found a door that led to a staircase heading into the basement. The sound of the music, the screams, and the chanting grew louder as we descended. Harrison went first, moving cautiously, finger on the trigger. At the bottom of the stairs, Harrison moved quickly to clear the basement, but someone was already waiting. A massive man in a dark mechanic suit, wearing one of those creepy masks, swung down at Harrison. Harrison fired his .38 into the man before he could land the blow. My right ear rang from the shot, and my left ear filled with chanting and screams. By the time I regained focus, the man had swung a hatchet at Harrison, embedding it in his neck. Harrison fell back, but still managed to fire a few more shots. I stepped forward, my 9mm leading me through the corner of the room. Old bed sheets hung from the ceiling, blocking my view of the basement. The heavy metal music kept pounding, and the chanting swelled, but the screams had stopped. I wanted to check on Harrison, but I had to clear the room first. I stepped over the body of the man Harrison had shot and followed the chanting, pushing through the sheets. The room opened up into a large space, dimly lit by dozens of red candles. A circle was drawn on the floor, inside which was an inverted pentagram, painted in what looked like blood. In the far corner, I saw dirt rising from the ground, with several graves protruding. At the center of the pentagram, a young woman, barely covered in rags, was chained to pegs in the ground, exhausted and bloodied from just giving birth. Around her, at each point of the pentagram, lay the remains of 5 recently delivered babies, now dead. A band member knelt in front of her, holding the most recent baby in his hands as it wailed. There were 2 other figures in the room, standing behind him. One had a massive 2-handed sledgehammer, covered in carvings and blood. The other held an open book, leading the chants. The air was thick with terror, and we all locked eyes in a horrible standoff. The man with the sledgehammer was the first to act, raising it to swing. I didn't hesitate. 2 rounds to his chest before turning to face the others. The man with the book hurled it at me and lunged forward. I fired twice more, but his momentum carried him straight into me, and we hit the ground hard. My head cracked against the floor, stars flashing in my vision. Everything sounded distant, underwater, but fast. I turned my head and saw the last band member, the one holding the baby. He placed it down in the center of the pentagram and grabbed the sledgehammer. I didn't even realize it, but my 9mm was still in my hand. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger repeatedly until the clip ran dry. The final shot connected with his head just as he raised the hammer to bring it down on the last baby. He crumpled, and the sledgehammer fell harmlessly to the side. Everything after that was a blur. I woke up in the hospital. Harrison had died. The band members were all dead. But the baby and the woman, somehow, they survived. The investigation was handed off to other detectives. They uncovered that the band had been abducting women from their shows, bringing them back to the farmhouse, and impregnating them. Once they had 6 pregnant women, they planned a mass ritual sacrifice to the devil. The other women had been killed after giving birth and were buried in the basement. I never saw the band members' eyes, hidden behind their masks. But I'm sure they held the same void as Emily's and Zane's. I once said I'd seen true evil 3 times in my career. That's true. But after that last time, there was more to the story than I could ever write in a report. It's why I retired right after the case. It was the moment I realized that some evil is beyond anything I could understand. When I first stepped into that basement, something else was there with us. Something dark. It was floating in the center of the pentagram, like black smoke, shifting and pulsing with red lightning. It expanded as the chanting grew louder, taking shape. I often wonder, if that last baby hadn't been saved, what would that thing have become? What would have manifested? And what realm of evil would I have witnessed if it had been completed?